60% of guns recovered in Chicago in 2017 come from out of state. And of the guns that originate from out of state, the primary source state is Indiana, followed by Mississippi and Wisconsin. And in terms of, thinking about what type of policies or legislation might kind of stem the tide, I think there still is a lot of research that we can kind of look into, and a lot of data that I think would shed light on what policies would be most effective. But addressing the issue of kind of the interstate movement of guns is clearly very important in Chicago, and even like intercity movement of guns if guns are coming from elsewhere in the county.
Mississippi, huh?
Yeah, Mississippi. Mm-hmm.
I totally understand Indiana and I totally understand Wisconsin because they're border states, but Mississippi seems I was surprised.
Yeah, so I'm not sure, precisely why that is the case. I think what I've heard before is that there are, several reasons why Mississippi might come up. One of them being that Mississippi was one of the states where a lot of people coming up from the Great Migration originated from. So there may still be strong family ties to that area. So in that sense, it isn't necessarily a stretch to think that many guns may come from Mississippi. But it is quite a bit of a drive from Chicago.
Do we know anything about what the gun market looks like in Chicago? So these guns, how exactly are they coming in? Are individuals bringing them in? Is there some sort of, cabal going on to get guns into Chicago? What does that look like?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. We are actually still to pin down exactly, how are guns getting diverted from the legal to the illegal market and ending up in Chicago. We, at the Crime Lab, we have a study. It's called the Underground Gun Market Study, where we're trying to identify precisely that. So we're collaborating with affiliates and academics in 6 major U.S. cities. Chicago is obviously our focus, really just to learn more about how individuals at elevated risk for violence obtain guns and ammunition through a series of interviews with individuals at the Illinois Department of Correction who are kind of convicted on a gun offense, or through administrative data analysis. We're trying to see, where are these guns originating from? When we ask people how they get their guns, what do they say? And also, what can we learn from that? So, a few things that are kind of interesting from this analysis. The first is just that the sheer volume of guns recovered in Chicago distinguishes it from other metropolitan cities. So quite consistently, Chicago Police Department recovers more guns than police in New York and Los Angeles. For perspective, in 2016, CPD seized almost 7,000 guns, which when we look at in per capita terms is 6 times as many guns as were taken in New York, a city much larger than Chicago. And then another interesting aspect of Chicago's gun violence and gun market is that the characteristics of the gun involved are quite different. So again, in our previous analysis in 2016, we saw that a larger share of the violence in Chicago seems to be committed by young people relative to what we see in other metropolitan areas around the country. We saw that in our report, 25% of homicide suspects were aged 10 to 19 compared to 15% in other metropolitan areas. And, that kind of indicates to us that teenagers are particularly vulnerable to the social conditions and the most distressed neighborhoods that increase people's risk of gun violence involvement. So those are kind of 2 striking things that stand out to us in terms of, how Chicago might be different from other cities.
Are there things that you would like our listeners to know? Are there things that you would like to add?
I think the one thing I would like to add is in terms of guidance for policymakers at the national level, when we think about how much money all levels of government spend on criminal justice every year, about $200 billion, in addition to the amount of money that is spent on education and human capital development, about $1 trillion if we think of education and human capital development as relevant to crime prevention efforts. Despite these enormous resources, we still know very little about what actually works to reduce violence and improve outcomes for youth. So, I think if we really want to make long-term progress on violence, we really need to kind of instill a feedback loop and stress policymakers the importance of, leveraging all of the innovation that's already happening on the ground leveraging that to generate better evidence about what is working, and then deploy public sector resources accordingly.
Where does the funding for the crime lab come from?
So we are funded through a series of channels. The federal government actually has granted us project funding for several of our initiatives. We also receive funding from foundations and a few private donors.
If any of our listeners wanted to donate, would they be able to do that?
Yes, if your listeners were interested in donating to the Crime Lab, you can find out more information at urbanlabs.uchicago.edu. There's a ton of information on our website about our projects and some of our results. Anything that your listeners are able to contribute, we would be extremely appreciative of.
And we'll post a link to that in the show notes, listeners, so you can check out their website.
Well, thank you, Kim. This has been extremely interesting. I live on the south side of Chicago, so I'm always so interested when I hear in the public sphere people talking about the south side of Chicago as if it's, this terrible war zone. That's not the lived experience that I have, but I know that there are parts of Chicago, neighborhoods within Chicago, that experience a much higher rate of violence. And so it's great to hear that there can be this data-based policing that goes on that can help reduce that violence for the people who are living there.
Right. And, most importantly, working with community members, the folks living in these areas to kind of co-produce a safer environment.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us. And I think our listeners hopefully have learned a lot from this segment. I know that I have. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Hi, this is Kelly. I just wanted to let you know that in the next segment, we'll be talking to Khary Penebaker about gun violence. This may be a difficult listen, especially if you or anyone you know has personal experience with gun violence or suicide. I do hope that you'll listen if you can, because he provides some valuable resources for those survivors of gun violence. Hey everybody, this is Kelly with Two Broads Talking Politics. I'm here with Sophie. Hey Sophie.
Hey Kelly.
And tonight we have a special guest, Khary Penebaker, who is a DNC representative for Wisconsin. Hello, Khary.
Hey, how are you?
Good. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me tonight.
So we're going to continue our discussion here about gun violence prevention. And so we've asked Khary to come on and talk about that. But before we get into that, I thought maybe we could talk a little bit about who you are and what it means to be a DNC representative.
Sure.
So let's start with that. You're a DNC representative for Wisconsin, and so that's an elected position, correct?
Right. So I'm one of four DNC representatives for Wisconsin. I am the second male representative, so you have to have 2 men, 2 women. And I was just elected June 2nd, which happens to also be Gun Violence Prevention Awareness Month, Gun Violence Prevention Awareness Day. So I got elected June 2nd, and I ran for Congress last year in one of the country's most conservative, most gerrymandered districts, and I ran on a platform of a strong gun violence prevention plank, and that we need to keep our community safe. I wasn't fortunate to win that race, but in running that race, I learned how to campaign, which made it even easier when the DNC race opened up, that I knew how to campaign effectively. I knew where I needed to go, the people I needed to talk to, how to talk to people, how to effectively market myself. And then, once I got in, you learn how like the machinery of the DNC works. You get to see some of the people you see on TV all the time. You get to find out like why certain policies may become a part of the platform, why certain policies may not. I mean, you see all these things in a perspective that you don't normally get. And it really has opened my eyes up to a lot of things. And I'm thrilled to be a part of it, and I think we can do quite a bit to turn this country around.
That's great. And so practically speaking, what does it mean to be a DNC rep? How often does the state group meet? What exactly do you do as a rep for the DNC?
Right. So in Wisconsin, we are, as a DNC representative, I am automatically on the admin committee and on the executive committee of our state party. So those two entities will meet at least once a month. Whether it's by phone or we'll all get together, and the meetings will happen all throughout the state. From the DNC, we're required by our bylaws to meet at least once per year, and it usually is at least twice. We had my first meeting was in October, and then the next meeting will be in March, and those also happen all over the country. And what it really means is that I provide I'm the liaison between the state party, the local parties, the folks on the ground, the grassroots folks, the county parties, the congressional district parties, all those folks, and then what's going on at the national level, right? So I have to relay information between all of those groups so that people feel like their concerns are being heard, that they are able to coordinate when they need to, that they have a solid plan or at least an idea of what's going to happen, instead of just someone showing up at your door and expecting you to turn over your county party office so that the presidential candidate can move in. And then there's, you find out what's going on at the varying levels, and then you find ways to make those different entities be as successful as possible. And at the same time, you're recruiting new people to come into the party. I talk a lot to groups of folks who may be, somewhat disaffected by the party one way or the other. They may not want to consider themselves to be a Democrat, but they vote Democratic. And it's talking to these people in the spaces that they're in and finding ways to try to, get them back on the same page and listen to what their concerns are. And hopefully we have a good way forward.
I didn't even really realize that position existed. So that's very cool to learn about that.
Yeah, there's 440 some odd DNC representatives from across the country in the United States territories, and each state's got a differing amount of DNC members. So like you'll have and this might vary a little bit, but typically it's your state party chair and the vice chair are automatic members, and then you'll have a certain number of folks like myself who are voted on to get in as a member. And then there's some at-large folks. So there's in total about 440 DNC members across the country and in the territories.
Well, that is very cool. And you're also a part of the Black Caucus within the DNC, is that right?
Yeah, and I just got elected to that at my first meeting, which was awesome. I was elected to be the DNC Black Caucus's treasurer. So that was a very welcome surprise, and I'm excited to be a part of that. As a man of color, as a person of color, I want to do everything I can to make sure that people of color who decide to pick up that clipboard, get their name on the ballot, and go run have the best chance possible.
All right. Well, we could probably keep talking about that all night, but let's talk a little bit about gun violence prevention as well. Yeah. So you are an activist around gun violence prevention and gun safety. So I've read your story and seen some of your YouTube videos, but could you tell our listeners how you got involved in this?
Sure. So on September 8th, 1979, my mom wrote a note. She left a note for her mom and dad. She got in her car and drove on the side of the freeway, sat there by herself, alone with nothing but depression and a gun, and shot and killed herself. I was 20 months old. So I don't remember anything about my mom, to be honest with you. In fact, I had to learn her birthday by buying her death certificate online. I just recently learned what her favorite color was. And so, I was 20 months old, and for the majority of my life, I did not know much about, not only about my mom, but about the issue itself. I just simply did not talk about it. And that's something that's typical when you talk to fellow gun suicide survivors. A lot of folks just don't talk about it. There is a stigma of the suicide itself. There's in some cases, there's a feeling of embarrassment, and you just don't talk about it. And it wasn't until I found an organization called Mayors Against Illegal Guns that I figured I want to be a part of something so that no one has to feel my pain.